Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our Ladies of the Sea Women in Sailing. It gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Genevieve White. Genevieve and I first sailed against each other a long time ago in 470s. And Genevieve has then gone on to sail much bigger boats, much further away from the shore than I ever dare go. And I'd like you, Genevieve, actually to tell us a little bit about where your career has gone and how you got there from those days all that long time ago in 470s.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to see how many people have logged in. I've actually had a little look at the list of names, and I certainly don't know you all, but there are quite a number of you that I do. So thanks very much. I started sailing dinghies. I actually started sailing dinghies in Canada on man-made lakes. That was after growing up with a father and a grandfather who had built a boat in the backyard. So they built a Herreshoff 28. Canada was, as I say, little man-made lakes. I came back to Australia and had to relearn how to sail dinghies because of waves. So, that was really the start to it all. After all, and yes, it was the 470s, and, had some amazing racing overseas and in Australia. But I then sort of started to do some of the bigger boat, round the cans, did some deliveries and got some opportunities to start doing some offshore racing. And the offshore racing, really right place, right time for a number of things, but I was, asked to go on bigger and bigger boats. I did end up doing a lot of the coastal races in Australia, and now it's sort of led on to, and it really is just a matter of learning on one boat, and I would then meet crew on the next boat, and I ended up started off trimming and ended up navigating. So that's a whole different world again. But with that, I've been lucky enough to, now that I'm older, recognise that I've started to tick off bucket list races. So I've been able to, do, I think I'm up, it's 8 Sydney to Hobart. So I know there's people that have done 50, but I got a bit busy with my business in between a lot of those years. I've been able to do a Fastnet, I've done a Transpac, I've done a Newport Bermuda, and a big stint inside that also was working on super yachts. I ended up in the US after some dinghy racing, and I went down to the Caribbean. So I've also done seasons in the Caribbean and seasons in Europe. Now, why I bring that up is actually I think I got an awful lot of seamanship from working on the super yachts. So you're working on these incredibly expensive, incredibly big, heavy, beautiful, but big responsibility boats. And so you had to, make sure you didn't break them. So I think a lot of the seamanship came from there, and that was an amazing experience doing deliveries, across the oceans. When I got back to Australia, it did lead to me setting up my business, which is Marine Safety Works. And really trying to use the experience from dinghies, from inshore, from offshore, from long distance. And I did do the 3 legs of the Volvo ocean race, and certainly that, was a whole different experience again, sailing past icebergs and, being closer to Antarctica than the rest of the world. So, there was some amazing experiences there. So that's a little snippet of what's been a very lucky and actually really enjoyable sailing career.
I mean, certainly one of the aspects I want to talk to you tonight about is safety on boats. I have to say thank you very much, because I know you supported our Ladies of the Sea coaching regatta, and we're certainly looking forward to the Safety and Sea Survival course you're going to run at the club in November, of which there's still spots available, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah. But, the idea with the 3 seminars we're going to run over the next 3 weeks is really, because we weren't able to run the coaching regatta, I thought if we can get together online and learn from some different people's experience, it would be really helpful. But we're about to go sailing tomorrow night. You know, some of the people wouldn't have been on their boats maybe since last March. You know, what are some of the things that they want to think about?
Look, absolutely. And it's one of those things that you can do, you know, 100,000 miles and still be rusty when you get on board. So, you know, it is a matter of if you can go through it methodically. I think most people know I teach sea survival, and one of the big things that I talk about in sea survival, or the first part of that course, is all about planning and preparation. You know, but Jen, we want to go sailing. Well, hang on a second, let's take a step back and do the planning and prep. So, you know, if we're talking about inshore, tomorrow night, twilight, that sort of race, it's still a matter of getting on board, whichever boat it is. If it's a boat that you haven't been on board, you do need to go down a bit earlier and just check the basics, and it's checking where the basic safety is. The thing about the harbour is for Cat 7 racing, you know, or inshore racing, there's not a huge amount of safety equipment on board, and you are very close to shore, but there's still the basics, and there will be buckets, and there will be life jackets, and there will be, you know, a knife, a torch. In fact, although they've even a torch isn't required in Cat 7 anymore. But I would be going down to a boat to familiarise from the safety side of it, really checking the life jackets. And if you've never actually worn a life jacket or fitted one, it's still, even for that sort of thing, doesn't hurt to make sure you're aware of what style it is and where it is. Certainly if you're going anywhere beyond a twilight, it then means that you do your own look at the equipment on the boat, talk to the owner, talk to the crew, but it really needs to step into briefings then and talking about what are the procedures what are the rules on this boat? What are the procedures on this boat? What's the chain of command? Now, sometimes it's really obvious. That person is the owner, that person is the skipper, but it's actually not always. And you can get yourself into a bit of a bother if you don't actually know who's who in that regard. A lot of people say, well, yeah, I sail with the same 5 people every year, or same 6 people, you know, every twilight. But it's kind of nice to go step back a bit and do the professional look at it, to say, and I don't mean professional paid, I mean a professional approach, or a seaman-like approach to, you know, gosh, I haven't thought about safety for a while, I'm more intent about what dinner is after the race. Well, to step back and say, okay, let's just focus on this for a moment with the safety.
Okay, so tomorrow night, I'm assuming people will go down and yes, refamiliarise themselves with the boat. And, you know, certainly one of the things that I think will be important when we go for a sail is identifying roles on the boat. You know, who's our trimmer, who's our forward person, and what will they be doing in each of our manoeuvres. You know, who's the person that's keeping a lookout and keeping an eye out for those ferries that
Sure.
are constantly on the harbour. And, you know, unfortunately on Tuesday twilights, well, when it gets warmer, actually maybe it's not going to be an issue this year with the cruise ships, because they're not back in action yet. But that's one of our challenges. So, but Jen, if I wanted to say even sail up to Pittwater, what are some additional considerations I might have to do that sort of sailing?
All right. So one of the things that I always have a look at if I'm going outside the heads, you know, is communications. So it's important to make sure that you have got the ability to get back to shore, and that's not mobile phone necessarily. It's making sure that you've got a VHF that works and or a handheld. So, you know, just that basic communications is a start. I go back to life jackets, and I harp a bit on life jackets in the courses, but, you know, that's an absolute. And certainly on a lot of conditions and a lot of boats, you know, to pop that on, it's not a problem to wear a life jacket, you know, leaving the head. So there are some boats that it is the rule 24 hours a day, that you always wear a jacket, and it's a really nice rule to have. But even if it's not that, then you can have a look at wearing your own gear. And then the decision actually on life jackets is, do you use the boat life jackets, or is it something you prefer to have your own equipment? I'm certainly not saying you all have to go off and buy a bunch of gear. But you also have to be happy and confident that what is there, you're happy to put on or to wear, should, you know, the worst case scenario happen. Now, Karen, you and I spoke before about, you know, do not leave. Well, actually, it was, sorry, someone else earlier in the day, and they said, well, you know, you just don't leave the boat. And I've always taught, well, do not leave the boat without permission. So, you know, that's also part of that. How do you keep everyone on board, and do you need a tether for that trip? Is it a condition that you need the life jacket and the tether? Some of the trips, not so much to Pittwater, but certainly if we go up to Port Stephens, we'll actually end up popping life rafts on board, you know, and it's that worst case scenario, having that equipment on board. But let's say we're going up to Pittwater. Of course, it's the provisioning of water and food, but on the safety side of things, if you go more than 2 miles offshore, you have to make sure you have flares. So there are regulations, which are government regulations, as well as just sensible regulations. New South Wales Maritime has a list of them. You know, it'll include your buckets. It'll include having navigation lights if you're actually going to be out there after dark. They don't have to be built in, because again, we're covering all sorts of boat sizes here. You know, it doesn't matter if it's an Etchells that's sailing up there. If they're sailing up and it's going to dark, they have to have nav lights. So reserve nav lights come into that. So for that sort of trip, it would be then worth sitting down and doing a briefing to say, here's the equipment we've got on board, and again, this chain of command. You mentioned with the chain of command who's, you know, doing the lookout. You mentioned, you know, who's on jib, who's on main, but chain of command in the safety part of it actually goes a bit beyond that, because it is, who is the skipper, who is ultimately in control here? What if the skipper gets bumped on the head? Have we got the second in charge? And we take this a lot further, obviously, if we're going offshore and deciding to sail to New Zealand for a delivery or a trip, or deciding to sail to Lord Howe Island, or, you know, up to Hamilton Island. But with all of this, it's a matter of going through the safety roles as well as the sailing roles. Have you got a first aider on board? Is there a first aid kit on board? Is there someone, sure, you've got the radio. I said you need that radio. Have you got someone who actually knows how to use the radio and has actually got a license to use the radio? So it actually, the tentacles start getting a lot wider when you start saying, what equipment do I need? And I've taken it a step further than that to say, actually, what people have I got? And can I actually also cover those safety roles, even on that little short trip up? And, you know, forgive me if it sounds like I'm taking it too far, but all, you know, the more you think of the big picture, even for your little trips, it means you're approaching it with more of a seaman-like manner. So that chain of command, you know, skipper, second in charge, first aider, you know, who knows how to start the engine, fix the engine, you know, the basics of the engine. You know, we might call them the engineer, but they don't actually have to have a degree. So even for little trips like that, it's nice to know how you're going to balance the experience and the people on board.
Well, and I'd say in the navigating as well. Do I need to be a navigator? Just take me to Pittwater?
Probably don't need to be a full navigator, but you do have to have a chart. Now, whether you choose to use electronics, and that's something that is changing in the world right now, but I would say to everybody, I mean, I quite enjoy navigating with paper charts. I've always enjoyed the art of navigating with paper charts. But I think for all of you, it's something that if you can actually learn to find the position, if it's an electronic screen, great. But you need to be able to say, I know how to find our position on that screen. I know how to find if it's the position or the cursor, or to move the cursor and work out a distance. So there are some really basic navigation things that are, you know, particularly if you're sailing in, you know, a couple sort of environment, you know, only two people on the boat, or there's coming up where there's going to be a lot more two-handed sailing perhaps. you know, to know how to find a position on a chart. And I would say on top of that, now women, our voices carry the best on radios. So it is a lot easier to hear a woman's voice than a man's voice over the radio. So it's one of those skills that is worth taking on as, you know, as the female, you know, on the boat. It might be 10 females on the boat, but that is something that is a really wonderful skill to have. Radios, navigation. If it's a paper chart, learn how to at least be able to put a position on a chart. You know, you don't have to do the whole course planning to go around the world, but you know, those basics are just wonderful skills to have.
And you know, yes, you mentioned actually getting a radio license. That is relatively easy to do these days, isn't it? I mean, it's a one-day course, or you can even do it online with some people.
There's a couple of ways to approach it. Certainly with the courses I normally teach, it includes both the VHF, which is the short distance radio, and the long distance radio, which is the HF. And honestly, the long distance radios are a bit of an black art unto themselves, because they get affected also by time of year, by the ionosphere, by solar flares. But a VHF radio ultimately is a pretty simple radio, and it's pretty clear when you're using it. There are two different certificates you can do. One is an Australian one, but note that if you do the Australian one, it only works in Australia. The second one is the one that most people would have heard of, which is the it used to be called the VHF Certificate of Proficiency. Now they've changed it to the short range certificate, radio certificate of proficiency. You can do your own study, and then you can do a test. You can do a course, and generally speaking, you do it over a couple of sessions or in a day. I've never been as keen on all of it in a day, just because I like it to be long-term memory rather than rote learning on the day and quickly do an exam. But if you're going to do it in a day, it's worth doing the study beforehand and getting to know it. The basics that you need to know for the radio certainly are the distress calls, how to do a routine call, which channel you're meant to be on, and if you've got digital, which digital channel. So I've just summarised the radio course really down to the very four basics. There is, of course, more to it. But no, it's not a complicated, VHF is not a complicated certificate to study or follow up with.
I mean, it is a requirement for all of us racing out of the squadron to have a VHF radio on channel 73. I'm going to have to check this on a Tuesday night. And we certainly, a lot of people are using their radio to call a tender and things, but I think it's when something goes wrong that you actually do need to appreciate the radio lingo or the terminology. Yeah.
Well, we'll just use etiquette or the radio. Yeah, the procedures, sure. Look, the thing about, I would also say, and you've just, you know, highlighted something, use it in an emergency. Well, you know, for all of us, then under pressure, can you remember all the details about something under pressure? And that's something that you can do, the simple thing by putting the VHF. There's a distress sticker you can put up by your radio. I actually take it a step further than that and make sure all the signs that go up next to the radio have got the name of the boat in them already, and the call sign, if the boat has a call sign, already written into it. What you're trying to do is minimize the amount of things you have to remember. So something as simple as putting up a little instruction sheet and a cheat sheet next to your radio, that's gold. You know, it is absolutely valuable. Now, you mentioned channel 73, which I saw was just confirmed. So Kristen just confirmed that. But you also would want to, in the harbour, have your radio on dual watch. So I know we're talking specific radios here, but I would expect you also to be monitoring channel 16 in the harbour. And again, that's fairly simple to turn a radio into dual watch, but again, it's that getting to know your equipment, getting to know your radios, and also having a little cheat sheet up next to the radio with what to say when, how to say it, and maybe what channels you're using. So 7.3, sorry, is a working channel. So it's not one of the calling or or distress channels.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, and now I want you to tell me a little bit about what we've signed up for with the safety at sea and sea survival course.
All right. So the sea survival course is actually very true to my heart. It is something that I just so believe in. The course is, and the way we're running it for the course that's at the squadron is we're running it face-to-face. We've got measures in place, of course, for all of the new world, and that, you know, all the COVID side of things, so we can give detail of that to everyone at that point. But an overall summary, we have a look at initially the planning, the preparation, risk assessment, looking at your chain of command, looking at your emergency station list. And what that is how you decide, you know, the skipper, you know, the second in charge, you know, the first aider, but how you decide in a fire, who's going to do what. In the case of man overboard, who's going to do what. And particularly in man overboard, and it's something that you asked me even about, you know, what about even for the local harbour racing. I mean, you see an awful lot of man overboards in the harbour because everyone's, you know, more relaxed and it's not perceived as dangerous as going offshore, but they may never have actually done a little briefing. So certainly with that, we look at the procedure of how you stop the boat and how to stop the boat, how to turn around, how to approach them, which side you're approaching them, how you get them back on board. So when I'm talking about this emergency station list, it's who's going to do what role in man overboard, who's going to do what role in a fire scenario, in an abandoned ship scenario. So we really do all the planning of procedures before you get to go out sailing. Because I run this marine safety business, I actually also bring a fair bit of equipment along for show and tell. So from a hands-on perspective, you can see some of the boat gear, and it's a combination of using a bit of video and the hands-on, you know, equipment. We do some workshops, so we work through how you might plan one of your standard operating procedures, emergency procedures. So really that's what we start the course off with, a lot of that. There's a fair bit of knowledge also in heavy weather sailing, in damage control, and a lot of it is being able to discuss those different scenarios. So think of the course as looking at different scenarios. Certainly on the second day, it sort of becomes a little more real for a lot of people because we get into we get into the water. So we do that at the Cornice Jet Base. Which I, to this day, think is for New South Wales, for accessibility as well as venue specifics, is pretty valuable. So generally speaking, it rains on that day, and generally speaking, it gets dark during the course. So, you know, we've got that environment where we're the only ones in the pool and we can control the scenario. So I spend a fair bit of time on getting you to get to know your life jackets, because even the sailors who are professional, who are sailing around the world, tend to come along and watch the life jacket opening up and life jacket packing portion, and they're just, you know, reminding themselves, shall I say, of the parts and what's actually on the inside and what actually it does. So I spend a fair bit of time with life jackets, and then you all get to go and do the exercises with them. And then we do the same thing with life rafts. We inflate the life rafts and we turn them over, climb in and out of them. The afternoon following that session is really when you get to say, look, we got you into the life raft, how do we get you out of the life raft? Or we got you into the water, how do we get you out of the water? So we look at the search and rescue. Search and rescue in Australia is amazing. And they learned a lot from Sydney Hobart 1998. You know, there were multiple high-risk rescues in 98. So we do have a very good support system in Australia for search and rescue. But the idea of the course is that we've got the idea of what we should be doing in preparation for the helicopter or the boat. How do we communicate with them? What sort of, what to expect in the life raft? Certainly we look at EPIBs, PLBs, so the equipment, and that's, you know, the majority of that afternoon is got you in the life raft, let's get you out. What I find with people doing the course is you'll go away, you know, and you will learn what you're ready for. So if you haven't experienced long distance racing, or if you haven't experienced, you know, severe weather, that doesn't matter, because the beauty of this course is that you take in what you're ready for, and you take in some information that goes to the back of the mind for a little while until you get to try it out. But there's certainly information that's good for a twilight, that's good for sailing up to Pittwater, that's good for just going out for a jolly or going out for a long distance sail. So it's quite a broad case. Can you tell I'm a bit of a fan of the course?
No, I'm certainly looking forward to it, and because I am wanting to do a little bit more offshore racing, but, you know, there's a couple of points that you've raised there that, you know, I suppose that's leading into what do we want to do when we go on the water tomorrow. And before I move to that, just if anyone's got any questions, please type them in via the chat function, and we'll try and answer them. But, you know, to me, one of the things we need to do tomorrow when we're all coming and getting back on the boat is actually have a briefing and, you know, refresh our memories with where is all that safety gear, and, you know, how do we use it, and look at our roles on the boat, who is going to do what on the boat. But touching on man overboard, you know, we don't want to fall overboard, but I think everybody needs to actually think about, if somebody does go overboard, how do you get them back on the boat? You know, generally all of these yachts have got really high top sides, and you know, it's going to be challenging. We're not as strong as we used to be or, you know, we're not doing chin-ups every morning. And, you know, it is a real issue. How will you get back on the boat? How will you get someone back on your boat? So I really want you to think about that when we go out there tomorrow.
Absolutely. Look, I think with those briefings, you know, you can, you know, treat it as, look, this is the beginning of the season. Let's actually run through. When I do briefings on boats, I will often brief other boats, you know, in the lead up to the Hobart, and I may not be racing with them, but I go on as the, you know, the external, you know, ring in, and it gives me the chance to sort of say, have you gone through these? Yes, yes, yes. And they've gone through the chain of command, and, you know, every now and then you'll find that, you know, the same person is responsible for everything. But what it does do is the briefing allows everyone to, even though they know what the life jackets are, you still say, look, you know, let's just have a quick look at the equipment hands-on here on the day. So those briefings, particularly at the beginning of the season, give yourself a bit of extra time, run through it, let people ask questions, because too often the briefings also are, okay, that's the life jacket over there, and that's the tether over there, and there's the bucket, right, are we ready to go? As compared to taking that step further and say, let's just have a quick look and make sure everyone knows whether they're automatic or manual life jackets. Obviously, if they're foam life jackets, that's, you know, a different story again. But
and in fact, that actually we've got a minor query here. When you're using the PFDs, you have to use the gas canister, or do you manually blow them up?
All right, so that question, I presume, was for the course. So with the course, we do actually use the canisters. It is so valuable to see what it's like when it inflates on your body. Now, having said that, because I service jacket, I have a never-ending supply of cylinders that are not good for racing. They've corroded or would never pass for a service, but we can actually swap those older canisters in for the session. I've also got some life jackets available for people as well. So I will always say with my course, bring your jacket along. We may decide on the day that that jacket is a fitting that is not worth using in real life, or it's just been serviced, but I want to see the sorts of people, if people have their own jackets, it's worth us looking at it. Because we can then say, did you realize there's a strap here, or do you know what this strap is for? But the actual session itself, we've got some training gear as well.
Well, one of the things, actually, I was having a conversation with someone today about preparing for offshore racing, and, you know, it didn't occur to me, of course, you would take extra canisters, because if your life jacket happened to go off halfway through your trip, you would want additional canisters so that if you needed your life jacket again, you're able to use it. And again, it's just one of those things I hadn't thought of. It's obvious, but we definitely need to.
They've actually added that into the rules now for offshore, which is great. You know, so some of those little things do get covered off because of the rules, but there's certainly a lot of things in the rules that aren't there. You know, and there's not, you know, the sort of marking items that you might use for man overboard, you know, and people always say turn a torch on and throw it in the water, but, you know, a torch often is quite a yellow, you know, not a super bright light. How do you create a Hansel and Gretel trail? You know, how do you make yourself seen? And that might be with glow sticks, that you can actually wave a glow stick, that you might use dye marker in the water, and those sorts of things aren't in the rules. So we do go through that certainly in the course as well. I'll tell a quick horror story, if you wouldn't mind. I went at a fairly last minute to go and join a boat, and we were doing a delivery from Darwin to Greece. So a long trip. You know, and I got on board and made sure that I knew where all the equipment was. The rest were crew that were permanent. The chef who worked on this boat permanently said to me, Jen, I don't really understand how the life jackets work. Okay, no problems, I'll show you. So I got the life jacket, I opened it up and took the bottle out actually to show her how the bottle fits, and that you make sure you check the end of the bottle that it hasn't been pierced or hasn't got a divot in it. And lo and behold, this life jacket, this bottle had a hole in it. Now these were the life jackets that we were using for a trip from Darwin to Greece. It is quite some time back, and I learnt my lesson. I proceeded to then service all the life jackets, and half of them had old bottles in. So the mate had serviced them and put old bottles in, which meant the only way that those jackets would have inflated would be by oral. There's always a backup, but we would have had to inflate them orally. So the whole thing in Australia is we're pretty good, and the clubs are making us service these jackets. But if you just jump on a boat, you can't always assume, if it's a boat that's not involved in that auditing program, you know, it could be that it's a jacket that's, you know, not in good shape, shall I say. So that's part of it, is going through and making sure all the gear's serviced, but also that it's actually been looked after well. Sorry about the horror story, but it means you've got to go and check your gear.
Well, I think it's also a good ad for have your own gear, so that you're confident with it. Another question, Joanna's got a question about her marine radio license that she gained around 15 years ago. Now that it's still valid, isn't it?
It is. So they never go out of date. Having said that, the certificates now include digital selective calling. So that certificate from 15 years ago would have been straight VHF, and that's fine, and it will cover you for any sort of vocal speaking use of the VHF. What the new VHFs have now is a digital section where you in fact have a bit like a pager, where you can lift a cap and you press a button, and then that button means that you are sending off a digital distress alert. So the courses now actually include that. The courses now look at modern EPIRBs, modern PLBs. That's actually included in the course also, because they use radio waves. And you will get a bit more information on COSPAS SARSAT. So the system, where does the information go from the EPIRB? It goes to the satellites, it goes to Canberra. Long-winded answer. Your certificate's fine, the new ones have more information.
All right, and there's another question here about man overboard. I learned to do a figure-8 pattern, but you believe that's changed and is no longer best practice. Now we're doing man overboard in the harbour. The logical thing to me says I need to be downwind so that I can control my speed to get back up to my sailor, or to back up to my person in the water.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to you and I when we were sailing 470s. And if either of our partners fell out of our boat and the other person managed to keep the boat upright and get to the helm, then on a dinghy, you would do a figure of 8. Absolutely, because if it's breezy, you don't go into a jibe, you know, on your own. Now, what I'm not so keen on is where people talk about with man overboard, this is the only way you can do it, you know. And so some instructors will say you will always do a figure of 8, and then others will say you will always look, going head to wind is a no-brainer if you're going upwind. So yes, you need to stop the boat, but it's how do you turn around and get downwind. So there are a number of different methods, and I'll actually experiment with myself to see if I can get a screen up in a moment. If you look in the Blue Book, which is, or the special regulations, which are the safety regulations put out by Australian Sailing, they do have a diagram in there, and it talks about quick stop. So what a quick stop is trying to stop the boat straight away. Upwind, you go head to wind. Downwind, the way the basic quick stop works is even with a spinnaker, you would go head to wind. You will find though that you know, absolute, you will do a quick stop with a spinnaker up, you know, is something that was taught in 36, 35 foot boats with symmetrical kites, didn't take into account those boats that are doing 35 knots or, you know, a 100-foot yacht with, you know, 8 guys on the bow taking a sail down. So my first answer is going to be every boat is going to approach this differently, but as appropriate to their own boat. And this is what we talk about in the course. And the whole thing about man overboard is you can't fix man overboard discussions in 15 minutes. You know, it's half an hour here or an hour there, and then we go and practice it, and then we go back and change it, and not so much change it, and we refine it. So the figure of 8 benefit is that you don't involve a jibe. So you go out at 90 degrees to the position, come back, you know, effectively 90 degrees, and you're able to dive below and then come up to them from downwind of the person in the water. So there's your figure 8. And if you want to avoid a jibe, it is fantastic. And in certain conditions, it makes absolute sense because it'll depend how much sail you've got up. And now I'm starting to introduce how big is your boat and you know, how fast is your boat. If you are sailing downwind already, well then to say you have to do a figure of 8 is not, it's not thinking about what's actually having to be achieved. So if you're sailing downwind already, are you going to take the spinnaker down first and then sail back? Or are you going to go to head to wind, deal with the mess, and then continue upwind back to the person? So let me give a little go, just a minute. I'm just going to see if I can share a screen for a moment.
One of the things here that's important is that we at least think about it. And
yeah, and by me throwing in those 3 different options, and what I want to do is just quickly show you some pictures of that. Won't be a second. I'm going to show you this now. Am I screen sharing is the quick question.
yes, I can see your screen. Maybe if you just want to do the
done it.
the slide
There we
share.
go.
So we just
there we go. Right. So these are basically the 3 different ways you can get back to somebody in the water. So here's your figure of 8. Someone goes in the water, and they always assume you've been going upwind for figure of 8, and the person always falls over, you know, upwind. So we would bear away, and then, you know, do attack, bear away again so that we get to leeward of the person and come back. I would argue, though, that it's too simplistic to say we just do a figure of 8. If we're going to do that, we also have to discuss, are we going to pick the person up where they are to windward of our boat? Or are we going to try and position our boat so that they are to leeward of our boat? And that's a critical discussion that has to be had in your planning of man overboard and how you're going to approach them. the people that would prefer to have the approach with the person on the windward side, they're, you know, wary of the boat drifting down or going over the top of the person. So that's their approach. The people that like the person to leeward like it because the boat would drift towards the person. Both can be right. So again, if you're told that there is absolutely only one way to do this, then I think that's a bit short-sighted. I think it has to be discussed on your boat on what is best for your boat, what is best for your experience, size, weight of the boat. You know, there's all those factors. As I said before, if you're actually going downwind, you are actually just going to do a tack and come back to them, you know, and it's then the decision, do you take your spinnaker down before you turn upwind, or do you just turn with it? And look, there are some very high profile sailors who still believe in going head to wind with the spinnakers up, and this is offshore. And there's also some very high profile sailors who would do a controlled quick, so get the spinnaker down in a seaman-like manner as fast as they can and then turn around. What it does mean offshore is that there may be the scenario that someone's in the water for, you know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And I think offshore you have to actually realise that it is very risky going in the water, and it may take quite an extended time for a boat to get back to you by the time they figure out sails. Please go by my rule of do not leave the boat without permission. And you can add that into all of your briefings every time, or a version of. When I'm teaching sea survival, I will always say, offshore, if you put yourself into the water, you have put yourself into grave danger. Now that's, but there's accidents, yes there are. But if you have that mindset of one hand for the boat and the mindset of, you know, avoidance techniques and planning whatever you're maneuvering and planning what you're doing, it'll reduce your risk of going over. Now this quick stop over here is the one on my right hand side, is the one that actually is in the Australian sailing special regulations. It always assumes you were going upwind. It assumes that you leave your jib up so that you do a heave to, leave the jib on the wrong side. As you're going downwind, you take your jib down, and as you approach the person, and again with this, you could decide whether you have your person to windward or leeward. That's a pretty good throw they've done there with a heaving line thrown to windward. I'm very impressed by their throw in that picture. So it's more than just having a straight conceptual, we'll do a figure eight or downwind or upwind. Is going into more detail of how am I going to stop? How am I going to turn around? Which side am I going to approach the person, windward or leeward? And then what equipment have I got? Be that a sling, which is behind the boat, you know, that you put out behind the boat, be that a parbuckle or a ladder that goes over the side of the boat. Am I going to use the transom? What's the seaway like? Am I going to use a halyard with a sling? So they're the more important things to put together as well.
Okay.
We'll just stop.
Yep, no, that's a great summary there, Jen. And I think that's probably enough for us. Like, well, I think we've certainly got plenty to think about. And I think when we go out on the water tomorrow night, I would certainly like everybody to, first of all, have a think about what is our initial briefing, how are we going to familiarise everybody with the boat, and how are we going to define everybody's role. When, just hang on. This is the screen I wanted. Give me a second. When we go out on the water tomorrow night, there we go. I hope you can see that now. What I'm hoping that, we've got a nice nor'easter, and just working on your communication and your manoeuvres, like starting to, what are we doing when we're attacking? What are we doing when we're approaching a mark? What are we doing when we bear away around the mark? And, are we with our one design boats, are we setting a spinnaker downwind? How are we going to manage that? Otherwise, the non-spinnaker boats poling at your jib, who's doing what on the boat. And if we can just work between our naval number 2 down here, which is off Clark Island, and between that and a mark we've got up in Athol Bay, and if we can just keep going back and forward up there, thinking about our communication on the boat, thinking about our sail trim. I'll be out in a rib with Andrew Parks from North Sails, and we will come alongside and have a look at how you're setting up your boat so that we're sailing it for the conditions, using the controls that we've got, whether it's backstay, outhaul, downhaul, traveller, so that your boat is comfortable and manageable. You know, I think the rule applies to absolutely any boat. If you're having to dump too much main sheet all the time, or if you're constantly heeling all the way over, then standing upright and heeling all the way over again, you know, you've got to rebalance your boat. You've got to think about what controls can I use to get my boat sailing efficiently. Jonathan's just asked a very good question here. You should probably do starboard roundings, because that's what we have to do on Tuesday nights. we do a port rounding around N2, but we actually do a starboard rounding around Athol Bay, because that's what you would be doing when you go around your top mark and get set up for a spinnaker. And we're going to be out on the water between 5 o'clock and 6:30. So it's up to each of the individual skippers to coordinate with you what time you're meeting at the club, what time you're going to get onto your boat and actually get out on the water. And I say 6:30 because I think sunset is just after 7 at the moment, and it's starting to get a bit dark from 6:30 onwards. So we actually don't want to be unrigging in the dark. Kirsten also had a really good question here, which might be for another night, Jen, but what do we do when we break our rudder? So we're inshore.
Oh, okay. Oh, look, really quickly, because I know, you know, we need to move on, but that is something that, you know, to actually break a rudder is difficult. You know, it's a matter of dragging something behind the boat so that you may be able to actually just drag and pull it from side to side. It is a much longer conversation than this. What I would say, though, that more often than not in the harbour is not breaking a rudder in the harbour, it's breaking steering cables. So losing control of the rudder. So what I would say when I say, you know, you need to know where the life jackets are, you should all know where the emergency tiller is, because for 90+% of the boats out there, it's a simple matter of getting an emergency tiller in if it's a wheel steered boat. And that's something that can be the difference between you running into the rocks or just calmly, you know, sailing along and getting your sails down and going ashore.
But even before going for the emergency tiller, would you just throw the anchor overboard?
In the harbour, oh yeah, absolutely. That's, I mean, again, it's going to be dependent a bit with your sails and how easily. The problem we've got is so many of the anchors are stowed below.
Right. Yeah, that's right. We can't have them on the bow when we're racing.
Smaller boats, you betcha. You know, because it'll be relatively easily accessible. It's going to depend a bit on which boat you've got. Yes, by all means, it's not that deep out there. So anchor's a good shot, and then emergency tiller is a backup.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say, for our one design boats like the Inglings and the Elliots, I actually think it's a great exercise to tie your tiller off and just practice sailing with your sails. Using your sails and your body weight to steer the boat, you know, it actually does wonders for your sailing when you get the tiller back. So, and
something that you and I both did many hours in all our dinghy days is that sailing without rudders. It's getting a feel for the boat.
Yeah, that's good. All right, well, we might wrap it up there, Jen. Thank you so much for joining us. Those of you that might be interested in joining us for the Safety at Sea Survival course. I think it's the 22nd of November, 21st or 22nd. Anyway, you'll see a link to it on the club's website if you go to the calendar, and you'll be able to find a link to it if anyone wants to join us. I'm looking forward to that weekend. I think it'll be great fun.
Yeah,
and otherwise, I look forward to seeing a lot of you out on the water tomorrow night. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us.
I'll say thank you as well. And, you know, certainly the sorts of bits and pieces I talked about work both inshore and offshore, but, you know, doing that training inshore and around the harbour is the most amazing place in the world to sail. So enjoy it. And, you know, Karen's got a lot to give. So I congratulate you all for doing that.
Okay,
thanks
again.
I happen
yes,
to
when you get back from Adelaide, please come for a sail.
Absolutely.
We'd love to see you. Okay, great. Thanks. Good night, everyone.